It was a quiet evening, the kind that makes you feel like everything is right with the world. The sun had just begun its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining County Road 12, where retired FBI Director Robert "Bob" Callahan was taking one of his favorite drives. He loved this time of day, when the noise of the world seemed to fade away, leaving only peace and calm behind. Bob wasn't your average retiree. For decades, he had been at the center of some of the most intense and high-stakes investigations in U.S. history. As an FBI director, he led teams that tackled cases involving organized crime, cyber attacks, and even international espionage. His name carried weight. People respected him not just because of his rank, but also because of how he handled himself, with fairness, integrity, and unwavering dedication. Yet now, after years of serving justice, Bob found joy in simpler things: tending to his garden, reading mystery novels, and cruising around in his beloved classic Mustang convertible. That night, Bob decided to take the long way home. The Mustang purred softly as he drove along the winding roads, the cool air brushing against his face. There was something therapeutic about these drives. They gave him time to think, reflect, and appreciate the quieter moments life offered. He rolled down the windows, letting the sounds of nature fill the car. Birds chirped in the distance, and the faint hum of crickets added to the serene atmosphere. It felt like nothing could go wrong on a night like this. But then, without warning, flashing red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, Bob thought it might be someone else being pulled over. He glanced around, expecting to see another vehicle nearby. But no, the lights were unmistakably aimed at him. Confused, he signaled and pulled over onto the shoulder of the road, bringing the Mustang to a smooth stop. What could this possibly be about? He hadn't broken any rules, or at least he didn't think so. Maybe it was a routine check, he reasoned. After all, police officers often stop drivers for minor reasons, especially out here in the countryside. Bob turned off the engine and waited patiently, watching as the officer approached from behind. He adjusted his aviator sunglasses, which he always wore during evening drives, and placed his hands on the steering wheel, just as he'd instructed countless others to do in similar situations throughout his career. In his mind, he ran through the possibilities. Perhaps a tail light was out, or maybe there had been a mix-up with the license plate. Whatever it was, he was confident it would be resolved quickly and amicably. As the officer drew closer, Bob noticed something unusual. The young man walking toward his car looked tense, almost jittery. His hand hovered near the holster of his gun, and his movements lacked the calm professionalism Bob was accustomed to seeing in law enforcement. Still, Bob remained composed, reminding himself that everyone has bad days, even cops. When the officer finally reached the driver's side window, Bob greeted him politely. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at Bob for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice sharp and commanding. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Bob blinked, taken aback by the sudden aggression. "Excuse me," he replied, trying to stay calm. "I'm happy to help, but can you tell me what's going on?" The officer ignored the question entirely. Instead, he stepped back slightly, drawing his weapon and pointing it directly at Bob. Time seemed to freeze. Bob's heart raced, but years of training kicked in. He kept his hands visible, gripping the steering wheel tightly to avoid making any sudden moves. "Officer," he said firmly yet calmly, "there must be some misunderstanding. I'm a retired FBI director. Can we please sort this out peacefully?" Despite his efforts to de-escalate the situation, the officer showed no signs of backing down. If anything, his stance grew more rigid, his grip tightening on the firearm. Bob couldn't understand why this was happening. Had someone reported a suspicious vehicle? Was there a warrant out for someone who resembled him? None of it made sense. All he knew was that he was sitting in his own car, unarmed, with no intention of causing trouble. And yet, here he was, staring down the barrel of a gun. Cars began to slow down as they passed by, their drivers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the unfolding scene. Some even stopped altogether, pulling over to watch from a safe distance. Bob could see the confusion on their faces, mirroring his own bewilderment. This wasn't supposed to happen, not to someone like him, not in a place like this. And yet, here it was, playing out in real life. Bob tried again, speaking slowly and deliberately. "Officer, my name is Robert Callahan. I used to serve as the FBI director. I have identification in my wallet if you'd like to verify who I am." He reached cautiously toward the glove compartment, careful not to make any sudden motions. But before he could open it, the officer snapped, "Don't move. Keep your hands where I can see them." The command sent a chill down Bob's spine. He froze, his fingers hovering midair. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined finding himself in such a predicament. Throughout his career, he had worked tirelessly to uphold the law, protect citizens, and ensure justice was served fairly. Now in the twilight of his life, he was being treated like a criminal, a dangerous threat rather than the decorated public servant he truly was. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Bob's mind raced with questions. How had this happened? Who was this officer, and why was he behaving so erratically? Most importantly, how would this end? Despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface, Bob refused to let panic take over. He focused on staying calm, breathing steadily, and trusting that the truth would eventually come to light. And then, just when it seemed like the standoff might drag on indefinitely, a second patrol car arrived on the scene. Its headlights illuminated the area, casting long shadows across the pavement. A female officer stepped out, her presence immediately commanding attention. Unlike the first officer, she exuded confidence and authority, her gaze sweeping over the situation with practiced precision. Bob recognized her instantly. It was Sergeant Linda Hayes, someone he had worked alongside years ago on a joint task force. Relief washed over him as he realized she might finally bring clarity to this bizarre and terrifying ordeal. For now, though, Bob remained seated in his car, waiting anxiously to see what would happen next. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Every second felt like an eternity, and Bob couldn't shake the feeling that his life had somehow veered off course into uncharted territory. Little did he know this was only the beginning of a story that would captivate the nation and spark important conversations about accountability, trust, and the fragile balance between power and responsibility. Months turned into years, and the memory of that fateful evening on County Road 12 began to fade for many. But not for Robert "Bob" Callahan. For him, it remained a defining moment, one that reshaped his perspective on justice, accountability, and the fragile balance between authority and humanity. Though life had returned to its quiet rhythm in his small town, Bob couldn't escape the ripple effects of what had happened. The incident wasn't just a chapter in his personal story. It became a catalyst for change that touched countless lives nationwide. In the years following the event, Bob dedicated himself fully to advocacy work, traveling across the country to speak at conferences, town halls, and universities. His speeches weren't filled with fiery rhetoric or calls for vengeance. They were grounded in compassion, logic, and an unwavering belief in the possibility of progress. He often started his talks by recounting the details of that night. The flashing lights the gun pointed at him, the fear that gripped him despite his decades of experience, but he never lingered too long on the negative. Instead, he used those moments as a springboard to discuss solutions, to highlight how systemic issues could be addressed through collaboration, education, and policy reform. One of Bob's most memorable appearances came during a national summit on criminal justice reform held in Washington, D.C. Standing before an audience of lawmakers, activists, and law enforcement officials, he delivered a speech that left no one unmoved. "What happened to me wasn't unique," he said, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "It was a symptom of deeper problems within our system, problems we can no longer afford to ignore. Every time someone is mistreated by those sworn to protect them, trust erodes. And once trust is gone, rebuilding it takes far more effort than maintaining it ever did." His words struck a chord with the audience, earning a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Afterward, dozens of attendees approached him, eager to share their thoughts or thank him for his courage. Among them was a young police officer named Marcus, who confessed that hearing Bob's story had inspired him to pursue a career in community policing. "You made me realize that being a cop isn't just about enforcing laws," Marcus told Bob earnestly. "It's about serving people with respect, empathy, and integrity." Moments like these reminded Bob why he kept pushing forward, even when the road felt daunting. Change didn't happen overnight, but every small victory mattered. Whether it was a new training program implemented in a local precinct or a piece of legislation passed to increase transparency, each step brought society closer to the ideals he believed in so deeply. Meanwhile, the fallout from Officer Derek Malone's actions continued to unfold. Following his dismissal from the force, Malone faced criminal charges including felony assault and misuse of authority. During the trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of his reckless behavior, leaving little room for doubt about his guilt. In the end, Malone was sentenced to 2 years in prison, a punishment that some viewed as lenient, while others saw it as harsh given his relatively short tenure as an officer. For Malone, the verdict marked the beginning of a long and painful journey toward redemption. Behind bars, he struggled with feelings of shame and regret, haunted by the knowledge that his actions had destroyed not only his own life, but also the trust of an entire community. Yet even in prison, opportunities for growth emerged. Malone participated in rehabilitation programs designed to help inmates confront their mistakes and develop skills for reintegration into society. One such program paired him with a mentor, a retired police captain who had faced similar challenges early in his career. Through their conversations, Malone began to understand the weight of responsibility that came with wearing a badge, and the importance of humility, self-awareness, and continuous learning. Upon his release, Malone chose not to return to law enforcement. Instead, he found work as a counselor for at-risk youth, drawing on his experiences to guide young people away from paths that might lead to trouble. It wasn't easy. Many judged him harshly for his past, but he persevered, driven by a desire to make amends. Over time, his efforts earned him a measure of forgiveness from some members of the community, though he knew he would always carry the burden of his mistakes. Back in Bob's hometown, signs of progress were evident everywhere. The police department had undergone significant transformations under Chief Alan Grant's leadership. Officers now wore body cameras as standard equipment, and footage was regularly reviewed to ensure compliance with protocols. Training programs emphasized de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and mental health awareness, equipping officers with tools to handle complex situations more effectively. Community engagement initiatives flourished, fostering dialogue and mutual understanding between residents and law enforcement. Sergeant Linda Hayes played a pivotal role in these changes, becoming a respected figure both locally and nationally. Her innovative approaches to policing earned her numerous accolades, including an award for excellence in leadership from a prominent civil rights organization. When asked about her success, she humbly credited Bob for inspiring her to think differently about her role as an officer. "That night changed all of us," she reflected during an interview. "It forced us to confront uncomfortable truths and take action where it mattered most." None of this would have been possible without Bob's willingness to turn his pain into purpose. As the years passed, Bob found solace in knowing that his ordeal had sparked meaningful conversations and tangible improvements. He continued writing op-eds, giving interviews, and participating in panels, always advocating for incremental yet impactful reforms. His message remained consistent. True justice required vigilance, accountability, and a commitment to treating everyone with dignity and respect. On quiet evenings, Bob often sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon and casting golden hues across the landscape. These moments of reflection allowed him to process everything he had been through: the fear, the frustration, the hope. Sometimes, he thought about Officer Malone, wondering how the young man was faring in his quest for redemption. Other times, he recalled the faces of the countless individuals he had met along the way, people whose stories had fueled his determination to keep fighting for a better future. Despite the scars of that night, Bob felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the support he had received from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. Gratitude for the opportunity to use his platform to drive positive change. And gratitude for the lessons he had learned, not just about the flaws in the system, but also about the resilience of the human spirit. One crisp autumn evening, as Bob sat on his porch sipping tea, he noticed a familiar car pulling into his driveway. It was Sergeant Linda Hayes, accompanied by a younger officer whom Bob recognized as Marcus, the same young man who had approached him after the summit in D.C. They stepped out of the vehicle, smiling warmly as they approached. "We wanted to thank you personally," Hayes said, extending a hand. "Your influence has been felt far beyond this town. Officers like Marcus are stepping up because of your example." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "And I want you to know that I'll carry your lessons with me wherever I go. You've shown us all what real leadership looks like." Bob smiled, feeling a swell of pride mixed with humility. "The credit belongs to all of you," he replied. "Change doesn't come from one person. It comes from everyone working together. Keep doing what you're doing and don't stop believing in the power of good." As Hayes and Marcus drove off into the twilight, Bob leaned back in his chair, gazing at the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky. He thought about the journey he had taken, from a decorated FBI director to an advocate for reform, and realized that his legacy wouldn't be defined by titles or accolades. It would be defined by the impact he had on others, the seeds of change he had planted and the hope he had inspired. In the grand tapestry of life, Bob understood that no single thread stood alone. Each strand intertwined with others, creating patterns that evolved over time. That night on County Road 12 had been a dark thread, but it had ultimately woven itself into something greater, a story of resilience, redemption, and the enduring pursuit of justice. And as Bob drifted off to sleep that night, he did so with peace in his heart, knowing that the fight for fairness and equality was far from over, but that it was worth every ounce of effort. After all, justice wasn't just a destination. It was a journey, one that required patience, courage, and an unshakable belief in the goodness of humanity. The weeks following the roadside incident were a whirlwind of activity for everyone involved. For Officer Derek Malone, life as he knew it had unraveled in ways he could never have anticipated. The once promising rookie cop who had joined the force with dreams of making a difference now found himself at the center of a national scandal. Every morning he woke up to headlines plastered across newspapers and social media platforms, each one painting him as the villain in a story that refused to fade from public consciousness. Malone's disciplinary hearings began shortly after the incident. Held behind closed doors, these sessions were intense and emotionally charged. Investigators presented damning evidence: dashcam footage showing his erratic behavior, witness statements from both Bob Callahan and Sergeant Linda Hayes, and even accounts from bystanders who had been present during the stop. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of an officer who had acted recklessly, allowing fear and assumptions to override proper procedure. During the hearings, Malone tried to defend himself, though his voice often trembled with nerves. "I thought I was doing my job," he repeated over and over again, his tone laced with desperation. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I got scared." But excuses weren't enough to sway the panel of senior officers and internal affairs, investigators tasked with determining his fate. They listened impassively, their faces betraying little emotion, but their verdict was inevitable. In the end, Malone was found guilty of gross misconduct, misuse of authority, and reckless endangerment. He was immediately fired from the police department, stripped of his badge, a symbol he had once held so proudly, and placed on administrative leave pending criminal charges. News of his dismissal spread quickly, drawing both condemnation and sympathy from the public. Some argued that Malone deserved every bit of punishment coming his way, while others pointed out that systemic failures within law enforcement training programs had likely contributed to his actions. For Bob Callahan, watching Malone's downfall evoked conflicting emotions. On one hand, he understood the importance of accountability. No one, not even a police officer, should be above the law. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for Malone. The young man's career had been cut tragically short, and his future now lay in ruins. Bob knew all too well how easy it was to make mistakes under pressure, especially when you lacked adequate preparation or support. Still, he believed firmly that justice required consequences, and in this case, those consequences were necessary not only for Malone, but also for the community he had betrayed. As the legal proceedings against Malone unfolded, Bob became increasingly vocal about the need for broader reforms within law enforcement. He gave interviews to major news outlets, wrote op-eds for prominent publications, and participated in panel discussions alongside activists, academics, and policymakers. His message was consistent. Holding individuals accountable was crucial, but it wasn't enough. True change would require addressing the root causes of such incidents: poor training, implicit biases, and outdated practices that prioritized force over communication. One of Bob's most impactful appearances came during a nationally televised town hall meeting focused on police reform. Sitting alongside a diverse group of panelists, including victims of police brutality, seasoned officers, and civil rights advocates, he spoke candidly about his own experience. "What happened to me wasn't just an isolated mistake," he told the audience. "It was symptomatic of deeper issues within our system. We need to rethink how we train officers, how we evaluate their performance, and how we hold them accountable when things go wrong." His words resonated deeply with viewers, many of whom reached out afterward to express their gratitude. Some shared personal stories of injustice they had endured, while others praised Bob for using his platform to advocate for change. Among the countless messages he received, one stood out in particular. It was from a young woman named Maya, whose brother had been fatally shot by police during a routine traffic stop 2 years earlier. Her letter was heartfelt and raw, detailing the pain and anger she still carried daily. She thanked Bob for giving a voice to those who felt silenced and urged him to keep fighting for reform. Inspired by Maya's courage, Bob decided to take his advocacy efforts a step further. He partnered with several nonprofit organizations dedicated to improving police-community relations and launched a nationwide campaign called Pathways to Trust. The initiative aimed to bring together stakeholders from all sides of the issue: officers, citizens, lawmakers, and educators, to develop actionable solutions. Workshops were organized in cities across the country, focusing on topics like de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity training, and community engagement strategies. Bob also collaborated closely with legislators to draft new policies designed to enhance accountability and transparency within law enforcement agencies. One of his key proposals involved mandating body cameras for all officers, coupled with strict regulations ensuring that footage was accessible to the public. Another proposal called for the creation of independent oversight boards capable of investigating complaints against police without bias or interference. While Bob worked tirelessly to drive change on a macro level, he remained acutely aware of the human element behind every policy and program. He spent hours listening to stories from people directly impacted by police misconduct, learning firsthand about the challenges they faced and the changes they hoped to see. These conversations reinforced his belief that meaningful reform couldn't happen in a vacuum. It required empathy, collaboration, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Back at the police department, the fallout from the incident prompted sweeping changes. Chief Alan Grant wasted no time implementing reforms aimed at preventing similar situations in the future. New recruits underwent rigorous training programs emphasizing conflict resolution, emotional intelligence, and ethical decision-making. Experienced officers were required to attend refresher courses, where they reviewed real-life scenarios and discussed best practices for handling high-pressure situations. Body cameras became mandatory, and strict guidelines were established regarding their use. Sergeant Linda Hayes played a pivotal role in shaping these initiatives. Drawing on her years of experience, she developed curriculum modules designed to instill confidence and competence in officers at every level. She also spearheaded efforts to foster stronger ties between the department and local communities, organizing events like neighborhood cookouts, youth mentorship programs, and open forums where residents could voice concerns directly to officers. Despite these strides, the road to redemption wasn't easy. Public trust in the department remained fragile, and skepticism lingered among many residents. Some viewed the reforms as mere window dressing, accusing officials of prioritizing optics over substance. Others remained deeply cynical, convinced that true change was impossible given the entrenched nature of systemic issues. But amidst the criticism, there were glimmers of hope. Slowly but surely, relationships began to mend. Officers started engaging more openly with citizens, taking the time to listen and learn rather than simply enforce rules. Community members, in turn, grew more willing to collaborate, recognizing that building trust was a two-way street. Small victories accumulated over time, creating a foundation upon which lasting progress could be built. For Bob, witnessing these incremental improvements brought a sense of fulfillment that surpassed anything he had experienced during his tenure as FBI director. While the scars of that fateful night would always remain, they served as a reminder of why the fight mattered so much. Justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about creating a world where fairness, dignity, and respect were afforded to everyone regardless of circumstance. And so, as months turned into years, Bob continued his work with unwavering determination. He knew the journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he also knew that change was possible, if enough people dared to believe in it. For Bob, that belief was worth every ounce of effort. After all, justice wasn't something you achieved overnight. It was something you built brick by brick until it stood strong enough to withstand the test of time. The moment Sergeant Linda Hayes stepped out of her patrol car, the dynamics of the situation shifted dramatically. Her arrival felt like a gust of fresh air cutting through the suffocating tension that had been building for what seemed like hours. Unlike Officer Derek Malone, whose jittery demeanor and aggressive stance had only escalated matters, Hayes approached with a calm authority that immediately caught Bob's attention, and everyone else's too. Sergeant Hayes was no stranger to high-pressure situations. With over 15 years on the force, she had earned a reputation as one of the most level-headed officers in the department. She wasn't just respected for her sharp instincts, but also for her ability to diffuse even the most volatile scenarios. As she walked toward Bob's Mustang, her eyes scanned the scene quickly. Malone standing rigidly with his weapon still drawn, Bob sitting motionless behind the wheel, and a growing crowd of curious onlookers watching from their cars or gathered nearby. Something about this picture didn't add up. When Hayes reached the driver's side window, she leaned down slightly, peering into the car. At first glance, she recognized the man immediately. It was Robert Callahan. The same Robert Callahan who had once led the FBI with distinction, whose name was synonymous with integrity and justice. The sight of him sitting there, hands gripping the steering wheel while a gun was pointed at him, sent a wave of disbelief crashing over her. "What on earth was going on here, Bob?" Hayes said cautiously, her tone softening. "Is that you?" Bob nodded slowly, relief flickering across his face. "Linda," he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "Thank goodness you're here. There's been some kind of mistake." Hayes straightened up and turned sharply toward Malone, her expression hardening. "Officer Malone," she barked, her voice carrying an edge of command. "Stand down. Lower your weapon." Malone hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Hayes's sudden intervention. For a brief moment, it looked like he might argue, but then something in her gaze must have convinced him otherwise. Reluctantly, he lowered his gun and took a step back, though his body language remained tense and defensive. Turning back to Bob, Hayes spoke gently, trying to ease the obvious distress etched onto his face. "Are you okay, Bob? Did anyone hurt you?" "I'm fine," Bob assured her, though his tone betrayed the lingering shock he was still processing. "But I need to know what's happening. Why was I pulled over? And why did Officer Malone point a weapon at me?" Hayes exchanged a quick glance with Malone, who now looked increasingly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. Then, without wasting Another second, she instructed Malone to stay put and gestured for Bob to step out of the car. "Let's get you away from here," she said firmly. "We'll sort this out." As Bob exited the vehicle, Hayes positioned herself between him and Malone, creating a protective barrier. This small gesture spoke volumes. It signaled to Bob that he was safe now, that someone trustworthy was taking control of the situation. Together, they moved a few steps away from the scene, leaving Malone standing awkwardly beside his patrol car, unsure of what to do next. Once they were far enough to speak privately, Hayes wasted no time getting answers. She radioed dispatch, requesting immediate verification of Bob's identity. Within moments, confirmation came through. Robert Callahan, retired FBI director, clean record, no outstanding warrants. There was absolutely no reason for him to have been treated as a suspect, let alone held at gunpoint. Hayes listened intently to the dispatcher's report, her jaw tightening with each passing detail. When the call ended, she turned to Bob, her expression a mix of anger and regret. "I'm so sorry this happened to you, Bob," she said sincerely. "This is unacceptable. I promise we'll get to the bottom of it." Bob appreciated her candor, but the weight of the experience lingered heavily on his shoulders. He had spent decades working alongside law enforcement officers, mentoring rookies, and leading teams through crises. Never once had he imagined being on the receiving end of such treatment, especially not from someone wearing the same badge he had once worn proudly. "It's not just about me," he told Hayes quietly. "This could happen to anyone, that's what scares me." Meanwhile, Malone stood frozen near his patrol car, watching the exchange unfold. He knew he was in deep trouble. The initial adrenaline rush that had fueled his actions earlier had faded, replaced by a sinking realization of the magnitude of his mistake. Hayes eventually returned to address him, her voice icy with barely contained frustration. "What exactly were you thinking, Officer Malone?" she demanded. "Did you even attempt to identify this man before escalating the situation?" Malone stammered, struggling to explain himself. I thought he matched the description of a suspect," he managed to say, though his words lacked conviction. "He fit the profile, and when I asked him to step out of the car, he didn't comply right away." "That's not how this works," Hayes interrupted sharply. "You don't escalate based on assumptions. You verify identities. You communicate clearly. And above all, you never draw your weapon unless there's an immediate threat to life. Do you understand how dangerous this was? This man is a national figure, a former FBI director. If anything had gone wrong tonight, the consequences would have been catastrophic." Malone hung his head, unable to meet Hayes's piercing gaze. The gravity of his error was beginning to sink in fully. Not only had he jeopardized Bob's safety, but he had also tarnished the reputation of the entire department. Word of this incident would spread quickly, and public trust in law enforcement would take yet another hit. While Hayes dealt with Malone, Bob stood silently, observing the unfolding drama. Part of him wanted to lash out, to demand answers and accountability right then and there. But another part of him understood that justice couldn't be rushed. It required careful investigation and due process. So instead, he focused on staying composed, letting the professionals handle the situation, while he processed the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. By now, the crowd of onlookers had grown larger. Some people recorded the scene on their phones, capturing snippets of conversation and filming the officers as they interacted. Others whispered among themselves, speculating about what might have happened. A few brave souls approached Hayes, asking if everything was all right. "We're handling it," she assured them curtly, her tone making it clear that further questions wouldn't be welcomed. As the minutes passed, Hayes ensured that Bob was escorted safely back to his Mustang. She apologized again, promising to follow up with him personally once the dust settled. "You deserve better than this," she said earnestly, "and I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Not to you, and not to anyone else." For Bob, those words provided a sliver of comfort, though they couldn't erase the trauma of the evening. Driving home later, he replayed the events in his mind, dissecting every detail. How had things spiraled so wildly out of control? Could this have been avoided? And most importantly, what lessons could be learned from this harrowing experience? Unbeknownst to him, the story of his roadside ordeal was already spreading like wildfire. Social media platforms lit up with posts and comments, many expressing outrage over the treatment of a decorated public servant. News outlets scrambled to piece together the facts, eager to break the story to their audiences. By morning, the incident would dominate headlines nationwide, sparking debates about police conduct, accountability, and the urgent need for reform. Now, though, Bob simply wanted to put the nightmare behind him. As he parked his Mustang in the driveway and stepped out into the cool night air, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Justice, he reminded himself, wasn't always swift, but it was worth fighting for. And if his misfortune could shine a light on systemic issues within law enforcement, then perhaps it wouldn't have been in vain after all. By the time Bob arrived home that night, the adrenaline from the roadside incident had begun to wear off, leaving him physically and emotionally drained. He parked his Mustang in the driveway, its engine humming softly before falling silent. Stepping out into the cool night air, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The quiet of his neighborhood was a stark contrast to the chaos he'd just endured. His mind replayed every detail. The flashing lights, the gun pointed at him, Sergeant Hayes's intervention, and with each memory came a fresh wave of disbelief. How could something like this happen? And why? Bob wasn't one to dwell on personal grievances for long. Over decades in law enforcement, he had learned to compartmentalize, to separate emotion from logic when needed. But tonight felt different. This wasn't just another case or investigation, it was personal. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning the very system he had spent his life defending. Was it broken beyond repair? Or was there still hope for meaningful change? The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows of his modest home, Bob sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee. He flipped open his laptop, half expecting to see news about the previous night's events already making headlines. Sure enough, within minutes, dozens of articles popped up across various websites. Headlines screamed phrases like, "Retired, FBI director mistakenly held at gunpoint," and "Officer faces backlash after aggressive traffic stop." Social media feeds were ablaze with reactions, some outraged, others incredulous, and a few offering support. One post caught his eye. It was written by a young journalist who had covered several of Bob's high-profile cases during his tenure as FBI director. The article began with a simple yet powerful statement. When even those who have dedicated their lives to justice are treated as criminals, we must ask ourselves, what has gone wrong? Reading those words stirred something deep within Bob. Maybe this wasn't just about him. Maybe it was an opportunity, a chance to spark a broader conversation about accountability, trust, and reform. As the day wore on, phone calls and messages poured in from friends, colleagues, and former associates. Some expressed shock and concern, while others offered condolences for what they called a grave injustice. Bob appreciated their kindness but struggled to articulate how he truly felt. Yes, he was shaken, frustrated, and even angry. But beneath all that lay a determination to turn this negative experience into something positive. If people were paying attention now, perhaps they'd listen to what he had to say. Meanwhile, back at the police department, things were unraveling quickly for Officer Derek Malone. News of the incident had reached top brass almost immediately, prompting an emergency meeting early that morning. Chief Alan Grant, a no-nonsense leader known for his zero-tolerance policy toward misconduct, wasted no time addressing the matter, head-on. Flanked by senior officers and internal affairs investigators, he stared down Malone, whose face was pale and drawn. "What possessed you to escalate a routine traffic stop into a potentially lethal confrontation?" Chief Grant demanded, slamming a file folder onto the table. Inside were preliminary reports detailing Malone's actions, along with witness statements and dashcam footage from both patrol cars involved. The evidence painted a damning picture. Malone had acted recklessly, ignoring basic protocols and allowing fear to override reason. Malone stammered through his explanation, repeating the same justification he'd given Sergeant Hayes the night before. "I thought he matched the description of a suspect," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "I didn't mean to cause harm. I was just doing my job." "That's not good enough," Chief Grant shot back, his voice rising. "Your job is to protect and serve, not terrify innocent citizens. You failed spectacularly last night, and you put the entire department in jeopardy because of it. Do you realize the damage you've done?" Malone nodded weakly, tears welling up in his eyes. For the first time since joining the force, he understood the weight of his badge, not as a symbol of authority, but as a responsibility to uphold justice fairly and impartially. That realization hit him like a freight train, leaving him overwhelmed with guilt and regret. While the department launched a full-scale internal investigation, public pressure mounted rapidly. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Accountability now," and "Justice for all, not just some." Community leaders called for transparency, urging officials to release body cam footage and provide updates on the disciplinary process. Even politicians weighed in, using the incident as a platform to advocate for sweeping reforms in law enforcement practices. Amidst the growing scrutiny, Sergeant Linda Hayes emerged as a voice of reason. During a press conference held later that afternoon, she addressed the media candidly, acknowledging the severity of the situation while emphasizing the importance of due process. "What happened last night should never have occurred," she stated firmly. "We owe Mr. Callahan and the community an apology. But more importantly, we owe them action. This is a wake-up call for all of us to reevaluate how we approach our duties and ensure that mistakes like this don't happen again." Her remarks resonated deeply with the public, earning widespread praise for her honesty and leadership. Many credited her quick thinking and professionalism for preventing the situation from spiraling further out of control. Others noted that her presence underscored the critical role training and experience play in maintaining public trust. If anything positive could be salvaged from the ordeal, it was the reminder that good officers exist, and that they deserve recognition just as much as bad ones need accountability. For Bob, watching the coverage unfold brought mixed emotions. On one hand, he was heartened by the outpouring of support and the calls for reform. On the other, he couldn't ignore the underlying frustration simmering beneath the surface. People weren't just upset about what had happened to him. They were angry because it reinforced long-standing concerns about systemic issues within policing. Bias, lack of training, poor communication, all these factors contributed to situations like the one he'd experienced, and until they were addressed, similar incidents would continue to occur. Determined to channel his feelings constructively, Bob began drafting a statement. Sitting at his desk late that evening, he carefully chose his words, aiming to strike a balance between calling out wrongdoing and advocating for solutions. He wrote about the importance of holding individuals accountable while also pushing for systemic changes. He emphasized the need for better training, improved de-escalation techniques, and greater emphasis on building trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. "I am fortunate to have walked away unharmed," he concluded, "but countless others are not so lucky. We cannot afford to wait for the next tragedy before taking action. Let this be a turning point, a moment where we collectively commit to creating a safer, fairer society for everyone." When Bob shared his statement online the following morning, it went viral almost instantly. Thousands of people commented, sharing their own stories of unjust treatment or expressing gratitude for his willingness to speak out. Journalists reached out requesting interviews, and advocacy groups invited him to participate in panels and discussions about police reform. Suddenly, Bob found himself thrust into the spotlight once again, not as a retired FBI director, but as a reluctant advocate for change. Despite the whirlwind of attention, Bob remained grounded. He knew that real progress wouldn't come overnight. It would require sustained effort, collaboration, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But if sharing his story could help move the needle, even slightly, he was willing to do whatever it took. As the days turned into weeks, The fallout from the incident continued to ripple outward. Officer Malone faced disciplinary hearings, where investigators presented overwhelming evidence of misconduct. In addition to violating protocol, he had demonstrated poor judgment and displayed alarming levels of aggression. The outcome was inevitable. Malone was stripped of his badge, placed on administrative leave pending criminal charges, and ordered to undergo mandatory counseling. For Bob, the resolution provided a sense of closure, but it also served as a sobering reminder of how fragile trust could be. One reckless decision had shattered the bond between a citizen and the officer sworn to protect him. Rebuilding that trust would take time, patience, and unwavering commitment from everyone involved. The months that followed, Bob threw himself into advocacy work. He traveled across the country, speaking at conferences, town halls, and universities about the urgent need for reform. He collaborated with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at improving police training and accountability measures. And he worked tirelessly to amplify marginalized voices, ensuring that those most affected by systemic injustices had a seat at the table. Through it all, Bob never lost sight of why he was doing this. It wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about creating a future where no one had to endure what he had gone through. A future where justice wasn't just a word, but a lived reality for everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from.